Welcome to bringing the cooperative model to equitable scale. As we start off, I want to acknowledge the remarks of the Administrator to Rural Business Cooperative Service, Rebecca Freeman Adcock, who we just heard from. The USDA has been an integral partner for cooperative developers for decades. The Rural Cooperative Development Grant, a program of the USDA, has supported dozens of cooperative development centers in providing technical assistance in cooperative education and training to communities across the US. Due to this work, more than 1,000 businesses have been incorporated, more than 15,000 jobs have been created or saved, and more than 4,000 cooperative housing units have been developed. And that's just since 2008. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge the valued partnership of the USDA and their role in building thriving, sustainable, and equitable cooperative ecosystems across the US. My name is Alex Stone, and I'm the Executive Director of Cooperation Works. We are a national network of cooperative developers that includes 34 co-op development centers and independent professionals who provide technical assistance, training, and support to cooperative businesses. Our members work across cooperative sectors and deliver much of the technical assistance and education supported through the USDA. Cooperation Works also runs the Art and Science of Cooperative Development, a cross-sector cooperative developer training program that prepares the next generation of co-op developers to facilitate the creation of successful cooperative enterprises. This conference is happening in a radically changed world from last year, as we can tell by the virtual format. The COVID-19 pandemic has unveiled deep fractures in our society. And these fractures are felt by the millions left jobless, the tens of millions at risk of eviction, by the thousands of small businesses shuttering forever, and by those who are bearing the devastating health consequences of this virus disproportionately, namely communities of color. And though the pandemic has exacerbated inequities in our society and made them undeniable, it is by no means the root cause of these inequities. But around the world, cooperatives have long served as tools to meet the needs of underserved and excluded communities, whether through mutual aid societies, workers reclaiming abandoned factories, farmers coming together to gain market access, or tenants buying their building to gain secure housing. The cooperative model offers flexible solutions to meet individual and community needs and to build a just and sustainable economy. In the face of a pandemic, the rapidly accumulating effects of climate change, and unprecedented corporate consolidation, now is the time to bring the cooperative model to scale. Each of our panelists today have helped build place-based, multi-sectoral, scalable cooperative ecosystems that have transformed the communities in which they were built. By drawing support from federal, state, and local resources, and combining private, public, and foundation funding with skilled cooperative developers, we can build scalable cooperative ecosystems to equitably meet the needs of all. Please join me in welcoming our panelists today. First, we have Cornelius Blanding, NCBA board member and executive director of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. For more than 50 years, the Federation has developed cooperatives as a means of self-help and wealth building, protected and expanded land holdings of Black families, and provided robust training for growing resilient rural communities. Cornelius has been with the Federation for 23 years and has been at the helm for 5. He has spearheaded international co-op development projects, managed a multi-million-dollar loan fund, and led the Federation's disaster relief and recovery efforts after Hurricane Katrina. Next, we have Arthur Sabati, a community development specialist at the Cooperative Development Institute, a nonprofit that develops cooperatives and builds the cooperative economy across New England. With a Master of Arts in International Economic Development, Arthur has assisted hundreds of cooperatives abroad and stateside. In his work with CDI, he's played a key role in developing the Lewiston and Portland, Maine cooperative ecosystem, which we'll be discussing today. Loris Lawrence comes to us from the Almina B. Sewell Foundation in Maine. The Sewell Foundation strives for the well-being of people, animals, and the environment by fostering social equity and community resilience. As the community and equity learning partner at Sewell, Loris devotes much of her energy to their Healthy People, Healthy Places program. Sewell's partnership in the Twin Cities of Lewiston and Auburn has been crucial for building a thriving, multi-sectoral cooperative ecosystem that supports affordable housing, stable jobs, and community stewardship. Jason Weiner joins us from Colorado as the governor appointee to the Colorado Employee Ownership Commission and as the co-founder of the Main Street Phoenix project. The commission supports the development and advancement of employee-owned businesses in Colorado, while the Main Street Phoenix project supports Main Street businesses across America in surviving the recession and transitioning to an employee-owned structure. Jason also runs a legal firm committed to building a regenerative and sustainable economy. Each of our panelists have contributed to scalable cooperative models that draw both private and public resources from local, state, and federal levels to invest in their communities, creating affordable housing, stable employment, and access to critical resources. We'll explore how unique strategies of this type of integrative approach have enabled scalable, multi-sectoral cooperative ecosystems to thrive in regions across the US. Today, we seek to address how cooperative developers use and scale cooperative models across multiple sectors for the greatest impact during this time of severe economic distress. We'll explore how the cooperative model has been used by BIPOC and other historically underserved communities in the past to successfully address economic disparity. Looking toward the future, we'll discuss how we can build on that history to support and grow efforts to build a truly just and equitable economy. So let's hear from our panelists. Each of you are working with projects that receive financial support from at least one and frequently more of the following. That includes federal agencies like the USDA that work on economic and community development, state institutions, private philanthropy, nonprofit cooperative development entities, and the private sector. How can we harness the support of the various sources to bring cooperative development to scale? And we're going to go ahead and start with Cornelius.
Thank you, Alex. Also want to thank NCBA CLUSA and Cooperation Works for putting this panel together. And thanks to USDA and the Rural Co-op Business Services for all the work, and this is the center point of this conversation. But Alex, I would jump in and just kind of echo what you said in the beginning in reference to the importance of partnerships. We, the Federation, we are a 53-year-old organization, and from the very beginning, the Federation recognized the need to make sure that resources from both the public sector, primarily the government, was utilized, but also working with the private sector and partnering with those in filling some of the gaps. But even more important than that, the cooperative community. The cooperative community has always been engaged in the work of the Federation, but continues to be important as we move forward. The cooperative community, again, in context with the private sector and public sector, is really the key to many of this. So those partnerships. As a federation, we look at things on multiple levels. First, the local level. Cooperatives are a product of that local community in which it exists. But then figuring out how the co-op or the local level works in conjunction with state partners, state government, but also other state partners. And then pulling that up to a regional and sometimes national level, but the international community as well. So I think if co-ops are going to be as effective as they can be, if we're going to be able to leverage them to really scale co-ops, we have to have a multi-pronged approach, starting with the local level and making sure that the local level is always engaged. Cooperatives are only as strong or as weak as their members. So we have to start there, but then make sure they have all the ingredients around it from the state, regional, and national level. And then putting all those pieces together, then starts to paint a picture that is scalable. But when we say scalable, we need to be careful, because if a co-op is going to be truly effective, it has to always be based on and governed by those members. And so we have to make sure that we don't scale things to the point where members lose control of their cooperative, or where members aren't as the most important part of a cooperative. But I think cooperatives are scalable, again, depending on how you look at scalable, but more importantly, they become effective when the members are truly engaged, truly own the cooperative, and are working in partnership from an equitable standpoint on the local, regional, state, and national levels.
Thank you so much for that great first answer, Cornelius. Arthur, can you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for this opportunity to share our experiences and knowledge we get from whatever we do with the communities we serve. I think I will not go far from my previous speaker. What I see as a potential for scaling, supporting the scale would be, putting the efforts in putting the funds together and orienting those funds towards a specific project, and be so much focusing on trying to think about the changes that we want to make, our programs and our projects want to make in the communities that we serve. I think that will be actually the actual scaling. I probably would just briefly speak about the work that CDI has been doing in some regions of Lewiston urban area. We helped a number of cooperatives which are predominantly owned and led by BIPOC communities, and we have consolidated different funding sources, especially from USDA and from other foundations like CWAR and other organizations, and focus those fundings to impact those cooperatives. Examples I had put on my notes include the Insuken Cooperative, which is the first Somali Bantu to be formed and make some impacts. We also helped some Roots, another one called Roots, New Roots Cooperative. That one is more open to new Mainers, and they are all involved in farming, and we have seen a lot of impact from those groups. But again, it's about consolidation of fundings from different sources and focusing on a particular project that creates bigger impacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. Loris, you have worked with Arthur and CDI quite a bit. I'd love to get your take on this.
Sure, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting all of us into the conversation. What strikes me, picking up both what Arthur was just saying and how Cornelia started us about the importance of partnerships, and in terms of scale, I think Maine scale is always an interesting conversation to have in Maine. It's one big small state, as we say. We have a couple of culturally diverse urban centers and lots of rural communities in Maine. So in a way, it makes it kind of an ideal laboratory setting for piloting innovative community-led approaches. And the work that CDI is doing in Lewiston, Auburn, the Sewell Foundation has been supporting and really learning a lot with them. It's really important, I think, as Cornelia has pointed out, to really invest in the partnerships, in the relationships at the local level first, and then to think about scaling up in ways that engage state and regional funding sources and partners, but always in mind with relationships at the center and the community base of the work. One example, another part of the work that the group that Arthur is representing, they are doing, actually before the pandemic, they were talking about starting a culturally appropriate childcare cooperative that would be owned and operated by members of Lewiston's immigrant community. And since the pandemic, the need has become all the more greater because so many of the essential workers in Lewiston, Auburn are immigrants. And so that group is continuing its work to start a child care cooperative, and with CDI's help and the involvement of a broad range of nonprofit partners in the community. And as that's happening in Lewiston, I think that other communities in Maine, I know I live in Portland, and we're looking also how do, especially with schools starting, with people starting to go back to work more, how can a cooperative model help to meet those emergent needs in this new reality?
Really important to think about. Thank you so much for sharing. Jason, can we hear from you?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be on this panel with my fellow panelists. In Colorado, we're fortunate that we have kind of an executive agency set up that places the small business development centers, our 13 or so regional SBDCs, as well as the Minority Business Office, under the auspices of the Office of Economic Development and International Trade, whose director, Betsy Markey, reports in the cabinet to the governor. But what that kind of streamlined agency structure allows us to do is set executive priorities from the top that will filter all the way through the various agencies and translate into coordination and consistent programming, such that all of the COVID relief funding programs and business support programs, grants, loans, et cetera, are all being consistently marketed and developed through the Minority Business Office, the SBDCs, and now with a strong coordination and eye toward employee-owned businesses, both supporting our existing employee-owned businesses, as well as looking to develop new employee-owned businesses. We know that in these times of disruption, we need to be doing both at the same time. This kind of ear to the ground, kind of surgically tailored approach of our local and state programming is also supported by federal dollars. Now with the CARES Act funneling dollars into state and local programs, we're fortunate that we're able to both develop special culturally appropriate marketing for the Latinx community and their business support, historically underrepresented business communities. The Minority Business Office has done a tremendous job, both making sure that there's adequate representation in the grantees, as well as making sure that employee ownership is eligible for all of these various forms of support. And I think that's really critical. The last thing I'll say is we as a commission are really focused on building a robust ecosystem of support and sending strong signals to the private sector for professionals, technical assistance providers, business owners, to all coordinate and work together in supporting our cooperative and employee-owned businesses. And the commission has done a really important job of laying the foundation for that ecosystem development. And it hasn't cost the legislature any money, but it's allowed us to build a playing field that will have some durability beyond administrations.
Thank you so much for that. I wanted to circle back to something Cornelius brought up, which was the importance of, even as the model scales, really keeping member control front and center. So the Federation has been around for 53 years. It works on a regional level. You do have experience with scaling the model. So what are strategies that you've employed to ensure that that member control, that really critical piece of the co-op model, maintains its importance and stays front and center?
Yeah, well, Alex, thanks for that question. And let me, what I always do is point to the structure of the Federation. I think it's the history and the structure that has been so valuable to this organization and has allowed us to survive over 53 years. The Federation, again, the Federation is a federation of cooperatives, a cooperative of cooperatives. It was founded by 22 cooperatives. There were 22 co-ops that came together and recognized a need that they had jointly as cooperatives, and they created the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. And so that structure, the way we're structured, there's members who are parts of co-ops. Those co-ops in each state in our organization make up what we call a state association with their own board and staff there to support them. And then those states come together on a regional level to make up the Federation with a regional staff to support all of them. And I'm supporting and running those that support system. But that structure, those cooperatives still at front and center, and each one of those cooperatives electing their own member, their own representative to represent them on a state level, and then they in turn electing amongst themselves someone to represent them on the board of the Federation. So we got a person from each state that makes up the board of the Federation, and every member of every co-op having representation on that state level. So it's a multi-leveled approach with having voices at each level, but with the basic voice from the co-op being the center of it. So the Federation is governed by those cooperatives by those members of those cooperatives. So I start there. But also when we look at this, we know that many of our cooperatives are very limited resource cooperatives. And so for us to do things like a regional marketing system as an example, we are responsible for aggregating the produce, not only of farmers all around the South, but of those cooperatives all around the South. So we started getting the scale by aggregating our members, those co-ops, those members of those co-ops, and aggregating their supply, their surplus to create this regional level. So we've been able to get the scale by doing one simple thing, which is one of the principles, cooperation among cooperatives. We practice that within our organization. So our cooperatives are cooperating together, and then we connect with cooperatives within the cooperative community. So whether it's marketing, whether it's technical support and other issues. So many of our first markets were to cooperative with some of the food co-ops in the Northeast. So we get to that scale by cooperation among cooperatives, simply put.
Thanks so much. We just need co-ops in the entire system, basically. Jason, I also wanted to circle back to you. With the CARES Act this year, the co-op movement had some pretty big wins with making many forms of co-ops eligible for funding through the CARES Act. It sounds like you've had a lot of success with that locally as well, and really getting the backing of local government. I'm wondering if you might just spend a minute or two discussing some of the strategy behind that, and especially if you were involved in the more national effort to ensure that cooperatives were eligible for that funding, and kind of what that looks like.
No, credit for making sure that cooperatives were eligible for EIDL and PPP loans really goes to NCBA-CLUSA, to the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. They worked tremendously to make sure that the really unprecedented expansion of the SBA 7A loan program for the PPP and EIDL, lots of acronyms, included cooperatives. I know that was arduous, and to roll that out so quickly was difficult, but we did see some successes. We also have clients that were unable to access PPP monies, and I think in part that was because of the systemic issues with rollout. We also know that PPP loan funding disproportionately left out businesses that were owned by people of color, and that's tremendously disappointing. We here in Colorado really kind of saw the leading edge of that and tried to address it with, again, greater intentional coordination between the Office of Economic Development and the Minority Business Office. We made sure that there was coordinated marketing and technical assistance. But anytime you're rolling something out at scale that quickly and it's being kind of developed in the marketplace through private lenders, you have to deal with all the inequities that come from these private actors. And we know the big banks were disproportionately the lenders of choice, and they have a pretty bad track record of lending to cooperatives, let alone Black-owned businesses and businesses owned by other people of color. And that's really unfortunate. We had some really important interventions where we were able to do fundraising and support our CDFIs, like Colorado Lending Source, Colorado Enterprise Fund, so that some of the community-oriented lenders were able to access the upstream SBA financing so that they could do SBA PPP loans for the underrepresented communities that are the focus of the Office of Economic Development and MBO. And importantly, I think we had some successes there. We continue to generate some kind of public-private interest in underwriting loans for employee-owned and cooperatively owned businesses. We still know that private capital markets are just not yet comfortable or familiar, and we need to be innovating and pushing the envelope to get some deal experience. And a lot of credit goes to the partnerships that have developed here between the finance folks at the Office of Economic Development and some of the private lenders and the CDFIs. I think they've developed a system so that if there's another new rollout of loan funding, we should have better results.
Thank you so much. And that somewhat leads into our second question, which is further exploring what successful strategies at the regional, state, and local level have happened, and what additional supports are needed to create an improved collaboration that proactively supports BIPOC community involvement. And we'll start with Cornelius again on that one.
Thanks again, Alice. So some of the examples we've had, and again, I start back on the local level. So really making sure there's an understanding of the needs in those communities. And so some of the work that the Federation is doing for quite a while that is probably not known as well as other work is around housing and healthcare. So we, the Federation, also own a multifamily housing subdivision that's about 3 miles from our rural training center. That's 40 families who are organized into a housing subdivision, all supported by the Federation, but more importantly, families governing themselves through the structure of the Federation. And that all started back over 50 years ago. One of the original co-ops within the Federation was something called the Canola Land Buyers Association. And you're talking about many families who were kicked off their land for registering to vote back in the 60s. Those families organized to buy land to develop housing for many of those families to stay in Alabama. Some of them had to migrate, but many stayed back, and they stayed back because of a cooperative structure, which then led to the Federation, a more regional structure. But the Federation has continued that work in terms of developing housing for families in those communities to develop on a cooperative level where they're responsible for governing themselves and governing their own housing needs. But also healthcare. About 50 yards from that housing subdivision, the Federation collectively owned a health and wellness center. That health and wellness center was and still is one of the only entities to provide some form of health care to families in those surrounding communities, which are some of the poorest communities in this country. Originally, we were providing direct health care, but many doctors advocated against that because they felt like we were getting into their line of business. So right now, it's a health and wellness center where we're just accessing doctors to come and do basic things like blood pressure checks and et cetera, but also being proactive and doing a lot of health care through feeding, making sure they understand the food they eat, nutrition, impact it plays, and some of the things that they can do wellness-wise. But at the center of it, those communities own and control all of that. So those are two examples I would talk about on a very local level. But then now on the state level, we deal with issues like heirs property. In order for there to be strong cooperatives, especially agricultural cooperatives, you have to secure land bases. Black folks in this country have been losing land for decades, and it's been a very disproportionate impact to those communities. And so we deal a lot on the state level with state laws, not only heirs property laws where families understand their ownership structure and how it is impacted by their family structures as heirs and how to secure that title, but also cooperative laws. And Jason mentioned some of the challenges that co-ops had in terms of access and resources. But in the South, we have very, very poor cooperative laws, and they don't extend the way they are in other states. And so therefore, we have a very hard time accessing resources because of that structure. So looking at those cooperative laws on the state level, looking at things like heirs property laws on the state level are things that we're constantly doing and dealing with cooperatives and their members from a local point and addressing those needs, but also on a state level, dealing with laws that impact the access to or inability to access things from that point of view. But then again, on the regional level, that to make sure that we can have some scale, if you will, and again, working through the cooperative community. So it all goes back to that structure, making sure that you're focusing on that local level and dealing with those basic local needs, and then really scaling that through cooperation among those cooperatives.
Thank you. Arthur?
Thank you. And one of the strategies that CDI has piloted, and we're seeing good signals, is to focusing on a specific geographical location, for reasons being, number one, you get to know the needs of that area, and you minimize the chances or the risk of what they call one size fit all in development programs. So by focusing on one geographical location, you get the chance to understand the needs of that population, and then you have the chance of developing the programs that respond to their needs. But also there's another benefit of that. we have seen that there is a potential of maximizing the funding opportunities that are particularly for that area, especially when you want to deal with public originating funding sources, like government sources. Most of the funding sources have to go through the state and then through the cities. So the city councils will have the approving authority and will have the allocation, priority that they want to follow. So when you want to do things that help their communities in that particular location, you have a chance to make a case and say that let's work together and utilize the government funds to help these communities. So that approach, that strategy of focusing a regional allocation for CDI has proven to be bringing good results. And we have, I will give an example again. When we worked in Lewiston, and Lawrence had mentioned this prior, we've been working in childcare, in farming and housing programs in the Lewiston area. And we have been accessing different funding sources from USDA, but also from the city of Lewiston. And we moved now to the Portland area, the city of Portland. And we are in good consultation with the city of Portland to support our proposals to help affordable housing initiatives in Portland, in city of Portland. And there's a lot they can help CDI, there's a lot they can help the community that we serve. So focusing on a specific location has proven to us that it could be potential for success. And when it becomes successful, you can replicate that and do some customization to the needs of the new area. So yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And let's hear a little bit more on that from Loris.
Yeah, I think one of the things that strikes me about the development of partnerships in the cooperative space is the different networks that have developed in the past few years. That there is a very strong network, I think, of groups, as Cornelius was talking about, a federation of co-ops. Well, there's a I think probably a less formal but really very robust network of immigrant-led organizations, nonprofit, as well as immigrant-owned businesses. And one of the things that we're learning as a foundation from, especially from our nonprofit partners, is that I think funders, to just be really honest and confessional here for a minute, funders expect their nonprofit partners to collaborate and coordinate their efforts, and funders aren't always very good at doing that ourselves. And so one of the things that we're learning, and really a lot from the different immigrant-led organizations in the state, is about the importance of really working together. And so we as a funder have been working really closely with other funders to try to coordinate, make sure that resources are getting where they need to go, make sure everybody knows, as much as possible, as much information sharing. I've been with the foundation for about 6 years, and I've already seen a shift in just like, we're all in this together, and that's what really I think is so important for the development of cooperatives. So hopefully, as funders are sort of being less competitive and more cooperative with each other, that is also supporting communities to do that as well. And I think the cooperative model is a really, really good approach to building that kind of really effective partnership in communities.
Thank you. It's such a refreshing take coming from a foundation. So I'm really grateful to hear about that from you all.
We are known for being humble and realizing that, we need to get over ourselves a lot. So, yeah.
Well, excellent. Jason, let's hand it back to you.
Something Cornelius mentioned I wanted to touch on, which is having available strong state cooperative statutes is really critical. I take it for granted. We in Colorado, we've kind of lightly coined the concept that Colorado is the Delaware of cooperative law. We have very flexible and robust cooperative statutes. We're really big fans of the limited cooperative association law that has now been adopted in some form or fashion in about 10 states. And I think it's important that we at least raise the importance of having a strong and supportive legal community that understands cooperative law, understands cooperative principles and not just the law, and is flexible enough to adapt cooperative legal tools, including limited liability company structures or forming in a state other than where it operates. We do this all over the country. We form cooperatives, say under Colorado law, and register them to do business in Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Minnesota, Maine, Massachusetts, anywhere. So this, I think, requires just a little bit of creativity, not a lot. But what Colorado, on a separate note, is doing in respect to the question at hand is the Colorado Employee Ownership Commission is galvanizing the broader community to put emphasis behind employee ownership by creating a complement to our Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center, which is a nonprofit philanthropic technical assistance co-op development center, by creating the Colorado Employee Ownership Office, which will essentially be kind of a housing umbrella for what we need and what we will hopefully create, which is a consortium of development resources, including an academic center, association of professionals, further development resources like RMEOC, Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. And we're looking to create the pillars of really a durable infrastructure ecosystem. And we just started talking about that this week at our commission meeting to form the Colorado Employee Ownership Office and build it out through a consortium that crosses disciplines and institutions so that it can survive crisis, it can survive administrations, and it can survive the comings and goings of all the different, kind of touch points and stakeholders in the cooperative sector in our state across, housing, worker, credit unions, agriculture. We, like Maine, are a combination of an urban corridor and then two rural cabs of the state. And so we really need to unify that in a cohesive fashion.
Great, thank you so much. We are running a little short on time, but I did want to loop back to Loris and Arthur, actually. I know, Loris, that the Sewell Foundation has recently shifted their strategy toward being more relational, and you addressed that in this past question. I'm curious to get a little bit more on that. You said that you're working with other foundations to make sure that money is going to the right people and really, really focusing on where that effort is and where that money is. I'm wondering if you can maybe talk about how that has impacted your relationship with the partners you're funding, like CDI. And I'd also love to hear a little bit from Arthur about what that's been like as a recipient of that funding from his perspective and from the perspective of CDI.
Well, I would say that basically, I think what the pandemic has done is sort of raised, everything is so critical right now. And so we're hearing very clearly from our nonprofit partners that they need for us to be more coordinated in what we're doing. And so especially during the pandemic, there has been a lot of the information between both funders and nonprofits has flowed very freely. And for many nonprofits, CDI has a project. There's a housing cooperative now in Lewiston that's being developed, and they talk to us. They tell us, because we're maybe one of their closest partners, funding partners, and then we have conversations with other funders so that they spend more time doing the work that they need to do in the community. So to the extent, I think that funders can take the burden off of our nonprofit partners to navigate our own funding systems so that we can streamline the processes. I think that is really helpful, and it's helpful for us to be able to plan, you know, to see, okay, that base is covered, this one needs to be addressed now. So I think it's a win-win for everyone.
Alex, is it my time to say something?
Go
Yeah,
for it.
so I think what I can add on that to the question, what we have seen in that efforts of strengthening the coordination between funders and non-profit grant recipients who provide technical assistance to the communities, we have seen that there is a kind of strengthened funders' voice towards the private sector as an education opportunity. We have seen private sector funders getting to know actually the needs of the cooperatives and the communities and taking that on front as a potential for them to put funds and money into that. It has become a window for us to tell the banks and unions and cooperative funding institutions to say, actually, you can put you know, your development finance or equity finance into these initiatives, and these can yield some economic value to your portfolio, but also to the community assets. So for CDI, by working together with other foundations, we speak to, you know, CFNE, the Cooperative Fund of New England, we speak to, you know, Genesis Community Fund, and we show them the needs on the ground. We pray to say, hey, okay, looks like we can inject some support into this. So it's an opportunity for raising our voice higher. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really great to hear about the impact of that on the ground. So for our final question today, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare many of the inequities in our society. Now, or this year, I suppose, we've seen 22 million people lose their jobs, with Hispanic women, immigrants, and young adults hit hardest, according to the Pew Research Center. Many of the workers deemed essential face low wages and no sick leave or health insurance. BIPOC in the US face higher caseloads of coronavirus with greater risk of hospitalization and mortality rates as much as twice that of white people. As small businesses close in droves, Wall Street is hitting new records. So as we're looking to rebuild an economy that actually works for everyone, how can we scale the cooperative model in a way to address these inequities? And we'll start with Cornelius again.
I knew you would start with me again. And thanks for that question. And I've answered it multiple times already, but I'm going to keep on answering the same way. But before I do, I want to point back to Jason, something Jason said earlier about coordinating resources, how well Colorado has done that. And I think that's extremely important in terms of really making sure that resources are coordinated. And Lars, you referenced it as well. But if there's going to be scale, and I keep pointing back to co-ops coordinating together and cooperating, but also on the other side of the equation is about the resources. And Jason talked about that in terms of how well they're doing that. And I think you call it the ecosystem of support. So I think it's important to have both sides of that equation. And again, Lars is pointing to, and it's so refreshing to hear a funder, the funding organization talking about that and recognizing that. Because at the end of the day, there has to be a recognition of the problem at its basic level and the people. And sometimes we're putting together solutions and we don't recognize the people who are at the heart of it. And I think that's extremely important before we get to anything. But in answering your question, these disparities have been shown, throughout this country and this world, have been around very specific areas. And these are the areas that have been impacted the most. Our food system, our housing, our health care, our child care, and also capital. Those have been some of the areas that have been impacted the most. Those are also the areas of opportunity. Those are areas where we can organize cooperatives and where cooperatives have been organized. And those are also the areas where we can scale. But we must first understand that we got to recognize those communities, those community-based organizations who have been doing this historically, and figuring out how do we put the resources where a lot of the work has already gone. And at the heart of this, at the heart of cooperatives, if we're going to scale, it makes no difference if we don't recognize those organizations, those co-ops that are doing this in the heart of those co-ops. If we don't recognize that we have to make sure that we're investing in infrastructure that's centered around the food system, infrastructure that's built into housing, infrastructure, the child care infrastructure, healthcare, and capital, and making sure that those co-ops and those members of those co-ops own it all. At the end of the day, if there's no true ownership in this, it doesn't matter. It's a house of cards and it falls. So we have to make sure that we're dealing with it from all those angles. I definitely commend my fellow panelists in terms of all the good work that has been going on. There's a lot, and there's a lot all over this country and around this world. And how do we recognize each other? How do we start building collaborations where we can connect to each other? And Lauren mentioned the work, some of the work I think she said CDI was doing around what you called it, the child care, by culturally appropriate child care. We too at the Federation have been doing cooperative development work around child care for a number of years, for decades. And right now our latest efforts is in child care models in Mississippi. But also making sure that this built around a local context, the culture of people in those communities. In the Black community, the majority of child care centers are young, single Black females who are the ones keeping the kids of our communities, of our state, of our region, of our country. But they don't have the support. And how do we organize them? But not only that, in order to scale a co-op like that, you must connect them to the other co-ops. And so we've been looking at the other child care co-ops specifically. And we've been looking at simply how do we get child care co-ops organized where they can aggregate and purchase together, have a purchasing co-op and lower the cost of food, but making sure they're connected to the food system and having healthy food and connecting them to the farmers. So there are a number of things, but the heart of all of it is one, recognizing the local context of this all, making sure there's true ownership in it all, and making sure that we invest in the infrastructure that these co-ops, that these communities own themselves, and then connecting those co-ops so that they can scale in light of the challenges of scaling with a co-op in the local community, so they can have cooperation among cooperatives. And I keep saying that because it's extremely important that we as a cooperative community work together and look at scale from that perspective, and making sure that folks like Lars and the Sewell Foundation and others are building a ecosystem, as you mentioned, Jason, to deal with things, but also, as Arthur mentioned, looking at the location-specific focus of it all. So I think there's a way. We just have to work together and make sure that this pandemic is just the results of this pandemic in terms of how people have come together and focus and figure out how to emphasize that we're all in this together. How do we build around that? And I think we'll get to that scale that we all been talking about.
So true. Thank you so much, Cornelius. We are going to mix up the lineup this time and go to Jason next.
I just want to echo one of the last points I heard Cornelius make, which is to really emphasize that a just reconstruction needs to come from local communities and be centered around local communities. The sad reality that COVID-19 has exposed is that we can't rely on the federal government for a practical, people-centered, community-oriented support safety net response. It's just not coming. And as we recognize that, we also need to recognize that the lifeblood of our communities are at risk. And the lifeblood of those communities are small Main Street businesses that it disproportionately employ our workers and employ women, people of color, and undocumented workers who are the most precariously employed, underserviced by benefits, and the most underrepresented in terms of the public safety net that the federal government has attempted to make available. And so on the dawn of COVID-19, I conceived a vision for a phoenix rising from Main Street, which would be to restore the health of our independent Main Street businesses, focusing on 3 industries: restaurants, child and daycares, and personal care businesses, using a traditional capitalistic driven strategy, the private equity holding company. And we created the Main Street Phoenix Workers Cooperative. It's a worker owned holding company that is currently looking at private capital to finance acquisitions across Main Street communities around the Intermountain West, to be bought so that we can immediately bring the workers back to work and into ownership positions to reap the upside of these distressing times. These businesses are sadly undervalued, and at value prices, we can buy the businesses, hold on to them, restore the underlying foundation, put the workers back to work, and essentially divert all the surplus that the businesses will be able to generate over time back to workers. So we formed the Main Street Phoenix Workers Cooperative, mainstreet.coop, and we just hired a managing director. And that's our strategy to use scale to kind of address the twin crises we face by centering women, people of color, and undocumented workers in the reconstruction phase, by stabilizing the business and putting workers in ownership positions to build wealth and be able to benefit from a diversified platform of income security, offering benefits, progressive compensation, professional development, all supported by a backbone back office infrastructure.
Thank you. Such important work right now, and really great to hear how that's building in Colorado. Arthur, can you share your response, please?
Yeah, my quick response would be just emphasizing on what most other speakers have said. Jason and Cornelius, both of them mentioned this. I think the ecosystem, the creation of a supportive cooperative ecosystem at state level, at city level, at community level would be very, very helpful. We want to see the policies, I think Jason did hit on this, we want to see the policies which are more friendly and user supportive for formation of a cooperative. We want to see a policy that actually unlocks those barriers and hindrances that are inbuilt in the systemic documentations. When you want to access financing as a cooperative, what are the barriers that the bank will hit, which are actually built on a policy or a registration or a statute somewhere. Once those are unlocked, in my view, that's the beginning of making the whole business workable, doable. Funders will put their efforts together, but once the macro environment is not supportive, it might not create a bigger scale. But once we touch on the ecosystem review and highlight where weaknesses are and what can we change, what can we improve, that will make a lot of changes. Syria has been working hard to create culturally appropriate programs in city of Poland and Lewiston, childcare, housing, trying to let the BIPOC communities lead the initiatives. But a number of times, there are some policies that you have to deal with.
Thank you, Arthur. Loris, why don't you close us out with this?
Thank you, and thank you so much to all of you for sharing your. I've learned a lot just in this one conversation. I think building on what each of you has said, One of the things that I think is really important that I'm hearing from Jason as an affirmation is the importance of advocacy for policies that will support cooperative development. You know, I'm very mindful, I said a minute ago, teasingly, but it's real. We're very humble in our foundation, and even more so when we look at the stats that the total of philanthropic giving in Maine represents 2.5% of the dollars in our state budget. And so really, you know, it's not our grants that are going to make, you know, a difference. It's you know, supporting the community to address its needs and doing what we can to work together with decision makers to develop policies that will support the development of co-ops. I think also in terms of scaling, and especially, you know, as Arthur just mentioned, and Cornelius, you had mentioned, and I'm dying to hear more about the childcare co-ops that are developing in your region. What strikes me about Lewiston Auburn is the importance that, you know, we use the language of ecosystem, and one of the key factors in any healthy ecosystem is diversity. And so, you know, it may be that a key to scaling up is keeping it small, but replicating it many times over in different places, and having a diversity of housing, food systems, businesses, services that are all using a cooperative model and other models, but that one I think especially because it's so effective at democratizing ownership opportunities, that maybe that's a key, is to have, you know, just a lot of ecosystems that have a very strong place-based core and a very robust diversity of different kinds of cooperatives. And maybe that's the way, I mean, that sounds like that's what's happening with the Federation, and that has a lot of promise, I think, for this work.
Amazing. Thank you to everyone who shared today. I want to acknowledge that we're a little bit over time, but I think that it was well worth it. I've so deeply appreciated hearing from you all, and just thank you so much for sharing your insights and experiences. I hope we can continue this incredibly important conversation throughout the rest of the conference and in our work as we move forward. There have just been so many impactful, or takeaways for impactful and effective strategies for bringing the cooperative model to scale in a way that serves and benefits everyone. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions from the audience, and we have some time for that now to take questions and continue exploring successful strategies. So once again, thank you so much to our panelists and to everyone who's attended this session today. And I think that wraps it up. Only 13 minutes over time.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, all of you. This is really wonderful, and it's so great to hear from all of you, and like it's just all connected. And I can definitely hear like echoes of different strategies and what you all are doing, and that's good.
Super.
Thank you so much.
We'll see you all in whenever the date is.
I'll send a reminder on that.
Nice meeting everybody. Alex, thanks again, okay?
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cornelius. Thank you, everybody.
Nicolette, do you need anything else from me?
You are good to go. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.